There's been a South Hamilton crossing since 1851. It was in September of 1851 that the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad opened into Hamilton. So that crossing has been there since 1851. It became a problem in the 1890s. By the end of the 1890s, it was known as the Hamilton Death Trap. Now, at that time, remember, it was still a person on horseback, pedestrians, horse-drawn wagons, that type of thing. No automobiles in the 1890s. But by the end of the 1890s, the people in Hamilton, the local newspapers, were calling it the death trap, and it has been a problem ever since. One of the reasons for the problem was that in the 1890s, you had Mosler Safe Company and Herring Hall Marvin Safe Company opening on out on Grand Boulevard. You had several other industries in East Hamilton. You had some in Lindenwold. All those areas were developing in the 1890s. So the traffic across the crossing increased dramatically at that time. Now, at that time, remember, it was still a person on horseback, pedestrians, horse-drawn wagons, that type of thing. No automobiles in the 1890s. But by the end of the 1890s, the people in Hamilton, the local newspapers, were calling it the death trap, and it has been a problem ever since. There have been at least 10 times where there's been a campaign or some start on correcting South Hamilton crossing, either with an underpass or an overpass. Most of the time, the plans have been for an underpass. The first was in 1909. That year, the city leaders brought in a man from St. Louis who at that time was the leading person in city planning, which was a new art at that time. And he prepared a boulevard and park plan for Hamilton. And one of the things that he spotlighted was the need for an underpass at the South Hamilton crossing. That was 1909. It picked up momentum in 1911. That year, the previous year, there had been 12 people killed on the crossing, several others injured, and numerous accidents. So it brought new attention to it. So 1912, the city is thinking about doing something. Of course, that takes us into early 1913, March 25th, 1913, the Great Flood of 1913. That stopped everything. The railroad at that time was willing to make the improvements in cooperation with the city. But because of the flood, both the city and the railroad, their damages were so great, and it took so long to repair the damages that they had no money for the crossing. They just went with what they had before. Another thing that came up in the 1911, 1912 era was the Socialist Party was very strong in southwestern Ohio. And the Socialist Party opposed the South Hamilton crossing. Their thinking was that the crossing would benefit mostly people who were able to afford automobiles. And to them, that was the more affluent people, and they didn't need any assistance like that. So therefore, the Socialist Party took a strong stand against the South Hamilton crossing. In the 1913 city election, the Socialist Party won the majority of seats on council and other positions in the city. So therefore, from 1913 to 1915, city government was actually against improving the South Hamilton crossing. That takes us into 1916. The Socialists lose some power in the 1915 election. 1916, another movement starts. It's moving rather steadily, but then 1917, April of 1917, the United States enters World War I. And during World War I, manpower was short, particularly in construction trades, and construction materials were restricted by the government. Priorities went to war needs, and so did the manpower. So any attempt to start the South Hamilton crossing in that period went down the drain. In 1920, Hamilton received its first city plan from a professional city planner. It was an extensive document, had a lot of great ideas. One of them was South Hamilton Crossing. In fact, it pinpointed the South Hamilton Crossing as Hamilton's major problem. It pointed out that Hamilton was a city lacking east-west streets and roads. Most of the streets and roads in Hamilton that carried the most traffic ran north and south. The east and west streets didn't cross the city. Think of some coming off the Black Street Bridge on either the west side or the east side. The roadway only goes for a block, or in the west side, about a half a block. It doesn't cross the city. The High Main Street Bridge is the only one. High Street and Main Street will get you across the entire city. To the south, the Columbia Bridge. On the east, it ended at South 5th Street, and of course it went up New London Road on the west sides. So again, no east-west road across Hamilton. The idea was to build a South Hamilton Crossing, which would link up with other streets and become an east-west connection through the city, and take the traffic load off of High Street and Main Street. That's a problem we still have. After receiving the 1920 city plan, the problem was, where does the city start? And because of the cost of the South Hamilton Crossing, it was not tackled immediately and was put on the back burner for a few years. Then in 1929, the city came back to the South Hamilton Crossing. Unfortunately, 1929, October 1929, was the stock market crash, which most people believe was the start of the Great Depression. I won't get into the details on that because some historians say it started actually a little bit earlier. But that got some plans started before the city ran out of money. The railroad was also investing some money in it, and they were willing to go with it. But the Depression, the impact the Depression had on both the city and the railroads caused the project to falter once again. The 1929 momentum carried over into the first couple years of the Depression in hopes that government relief programs would provide some money that would help build the underpass. One of the things that was done in that period, in early 1931, a survey was taken at the South Hamilton Crossing because of complaints of motorists being delayed for long periods of time. They did an 8-hour survey during the day, found that the crossing within that 8-hour period had been blocked a total of 199 times. In other words, 25 times every 60 minutes. That crossing was blocked. That presented the problem, but as the Depression continued, there was no money available locally or otherwise to solve the problem. Some people might ask, why was the attention on South Hamilton and not High Street in a lot of these years? When that 1931 survey was done, when there were 199 blockages of the South Hamilton crossing in 8 hours, there were only 25 blockings of the High Street crossing. The reason for that is that South Hamilton, the problem was not only trains passing through Hamilton. It was trains originating, stopping, and trains being, freight cars being switched in Hamilton. The South Hamilton Crossing at one time had the capacity to store 1,150 freight cars. And most of the time, it didn't come up to that peak, but it was very close. So during the average day, steam switching locomotives were going back and forth across that crossing, sometimes for only a few seconds, sometimes for minutes. But there were also times when, because of a problem on the train stopped in the crossing and it was blocked for as much as a half hour or an hour. It became a real nuisance. There was some hope for help from the federal government in 1935. Congress had passed numerous pieces of legislation during the Depression to try to solve or at least assist problems that had been lingering for many years. And in 1934, a bill was passed to provide cities and counties and states with money to improve safety at railroad crossings. In Hamilton, at that time, there were 50 at-grade crossings, 50 places where a motorist could be delayed, pedestrian also, by a train. And most of those crossings had no warning system at all. In fact, Hamilton was rather progressive. Hamilton had watchmen, in other words, a person employed to man the crossing and hold up a handheld sign to tell you to stop as you were approaching the crossing. That was considered progress and had been in effect for several years. However, that system was not good in rain, darkness, snow, fog, so on and so forth. And there had been numerous accidents at railroad crossings, many, many more than we experience now. It was almost a weekly experience of a bad accident with serious injuries or fatalities somewhere in the city or close by. The 1934 legislation then gave cities grants. They had to apply for them and justify their application. Hamilton decided that, yes, South Hamilton was a problem, but federal funds would not be enough to complete the project, so they applied for grants to signalize 23 crossings in the city. And that, again, as I said, was a great leap forward, because now you had lighted, flashing signals and even gates at 23 crossings within a year of that receiving that grant. It was, I think the whole project was completed in 1937. Again, going back to what the problem had been, the watchmen weren't on duty 24 hours a day. There was a watchman or two at South Hamilton Crossing 24 hours a day, but nowhere else in the city. So as you approached the crossing, there would be no signal, no electric signal, no watchman, and you proceeded across the track completely at your own risk. It was a very dangerous situation. After 1935, it was a long time before the city refocused on South Hamilton Crossing. You had the end of the Depression, the start of World War II in Europe, and of course, in December of 1941, the United States involvement in World War I. Once again, as in World War I, materials were restricted for defense uses. Manpower, there were never enough people to man all the jobs in Hamilton's factories, so there were none to spare for construction work. Even residential housing was stopped and became quite a problem. So it wasn't until 1948, 3 years after the war ended, that city leaders got back to looking at South Hamilton Crossing and deciding what they were going to do about it. In 1948, the city received a new city plan, an update of the 1920 plan. And once again, one of the focal points of that plan was the need to improve the situation at South Hamilton Crossing. The railroad business was at its peak in the late 1940s, and the crossing was more of a hazard, more of a nuisance than it had ever been before. Strangely enough, it seemed like there was money available. The 1948 study showed that in 3.5 hours at the South Hamilton Crossing, 531 automobiles were delayed at the crossing. Some of these were trucks hauling for business purposes also. So periodically through the last 107 years, there have been studies that have emphasized how much it costs, either the individual driver or what it costs businesses to have a truck sit at that crossing. You have the fuel expense plus you're paying a driver and you're getting nothing. You're not moving. So the costs to individuals and businesses have been astronomical over the years. The city decided that it would put a bond issue on the ballot in November of 1948. Problem was, it put some other issues on the ballot too. And people of Hamilton weren't willing to fork over the total amount of money that the city was requesting. The mistake there had been they had asked for too much, for too many things, and the citizens weren't ready to bite all that off at one time. It failed. It's unfortunate because the price at that time would have been $2.5 million for an underpass, whereas here in 2016, we're talking about the anticipated cost being close to $30 million, a great difference. 4 years later, in 1952, the city came back with, again, a plan for the South Hamilton crossing. Once again, it put it on the ballot. This time, the situation was even more challenging. It was one of 7 issues on the ballot in 1952, and the voters said no, that was just too much, and rejected all of them, which I think the total number were 7, that covered everything from swimming pools to the South Hamilton crossing to a new Columbia Bridge, just a whole laundry list of civic improvements. And the other unfortunate thing, no one supported any of them. No one came out. There was no campaigns that try to convince people what was needed and try to get passage. Another campaign to build a South Hamilton crossing. Once again, the ballot was loaded up with money issues, and the citizens of Hamilton said no. Also during these post-war periods, it was tough to pass anything because it wasn't a simple majority that was needed. At that time, the state required 55% approval on money issues, and anything that came close to 50% or just over 50% failed because it didn't reach that 55% plateau. After the South Hamilton crossing failed in the November 1957 election, the city started to turn some of its attention to High Street. High Street was becoming a problem as the number of automobiles increased with the auto booms of the late 40s and 50s. Also, the public transit was crossing High Street, not South Hamilton crossing. So Hamilton's bus system was found it difficult to maintain a schedule with trains interrupting their travel at both 5th Street and 4th Street. There were numerous examples of ambulances, paramedic units, other fire and police vehicles being delayed for several minutes because of the rather common experience of being delayed at 5th Street and then being delayed again at 4th Street by a train passing through Hamilton. There was nothing done on South Hamilton Crossing from that 1957 ballot until 2004. That year, the city revived the project, hired a consultant, and made some progress on the very preliminary steps that were needed to look at the problem, start to look at sources of money. But then, of course, the city ran into financial problems, and you run into the recession of 2007, 2008, and the years after, and it took a back seat once again. That brings us up to 2010. In that year, the city asked the Butler County Transportation Improvement District to look at the project and to manage the project for the city of Hamilton. Contracts were exchanged between the city and the TID in late 2010, and that brings us up to the present, where as I speak, we are hopefully about 2 months away from taking bids on the project and starting some preliminary work sometime here in 2016 with a hopeful completion date of 2018.